A ledger does not forget. One line, one entry. One debt recorded against your name by a system that was never authorized to charge you in the first place. You've been carrying an invoice you never signed, and you've been carrying it so long that you stopped asking whether the bill was even yours. You just kept paying it. Every season, every cycle, every time the line moved further out, you adjusted your footing and held. Somewhere in all those years, something shifted inside you without your permission. You began to believe the struggle was the assignment. That endurance wasn't the passage, it was the point. That you were built for a battle, and the battle was meant to be permanent. That thought moved in so quietly you never noticed it arrive. And it's been running in the background ever since, draining something you didn't even know you were losing. Here's what that thought actually is. It's a counterfeit conclusion planted by an opposition that needs you to believe the trial has no end date, because as long as you believe the testing phase is your permanent address, you won't begin stepping into what the testing phase was preparing you to hold. The final decree is not a metaphor, it's not poetic language wrapped around a spiritual concept to give it weight. In the actual operating system running beneath what your physical eyes can register, what the old texts called lex eterna balancing, universal ledger resolution, the final decree is the formal closing of a legal file that has been open longer than you've been alive. Sit with that for a moment, a file that predates your earliest memory. A case assigned before you had language for what was happening to you. A proceeding that continued through every relocation, every rupture, every year you thought, surely this is the year it finally breaks. And it didn't break. The file stayed open because the test was still running. The test was still running because the calibration wasn't yet complete. When I say a court you've never seen issues a ruling you've been waiting for since before you had words for what you were waiting for, I'm not describing doctrine. I'm describing something you've already felt. As pressure. The specific texture of carrying a weight that has no name in any language you were taught. The weight of a trial you didn't choose but couldn't leave because leaving would have required becoming someone else entirely. And that door was never actually open to you. It was sealed. Pause, and the sealing wasn't cruelty. It was the architecture making sure you'd reach the decree. Here's what's underneath the life you've been living. Every spiritual incarnate carrying a high-voltage assignment, and if you're still here, still recognizing what I'm describing, still feeling the pressure of it in your chest, that means you. Each one moves through a predetermined, legally bound period of severe structural testing. The traditions that predate the traditions you were handed as a child had a name for this. The trial of fire, the sovereign stress test. They understood something we lost across centuries of translation and institutional drift. The pressure was never punishment. It was calibration, and calibration has a hard deadline. It ends when the measure is met, not when the vessel feels ready, not when the vessel asks for relief. When the measure is met, during this phase, and I'm describing your life, the sequence you've already walked, the vessel is subjected to friction that makes no sense from the outside, scarcity that arrives in the middle of obedience. Not as consequence, but as test material, isolation that deepens the more you reach toward connection, as if reaching itself triggers a counterforce designed to ask one question: will you still reach when reaching costs more than it returns? Systemic opposition that feels designed because it is designed. Not by the people you can see, by an architecture that needs to confirm one thing before it releases what it's been holding in escrow for the full duration of your trial. Can this vessel maintain baseline integrity when every external signal says collapse? When every indicator reads failure? When the visible evidence suggests the test has been failed, the calibration rejected? That is the entire examination. Not performance, not perfection, not never stumbling. Stumbling was factored in from the beginning. Integrity. The refusal to reach for low-frequency mechanisms when the pressure gave you every justification to use them. Malice, when malice was handed to you with full social permission. Manipulation, when manipulation would have been faster and easier and the outcome would have arrived sooner. Surrender to fear, when fear was the most rational response the data supported. You held. Not flawlessly, not without cost that still aches when you press on it. But you held. Why would the architecture go to such lengths to test a vessel it already chose? That's not a rhetorical question, and the answer reaches deeper than the testing itself. Now hear what universal law dictates in response. No testing phase can exist indefinitely. The architecture doesn't permit it, not only because of mercy, though mercy is present, but because of law. The law of equity and proportional restitution governs the duration of trial for every chosen vessel. The stress test has a legal limit. It cannot exceed its own statute. When the test has run its full measure and the vessel has maintained field integrity through the entire sequence, not part of it, the full span, the spiritual court issues a decree of that same binding, irreversible character described earlier, the final decree, the formal closing of the legal file. Reversible, that word is doing more work than it looks like. Not conditional on future performance, not probationary, not subject to appeal by any opposition force that would prefer you remain in the cycle. The opposition loses standing. The file closes. And once a file is closed in this court, no party, no matter what authority it once held over your case, can reopen it. What happens in that moment isn't a gradual improvement. It's not a slow shift in atmosphere, not a season of incremental relief. It's a legal event. The decree marks the exact point where testing stops and mandatory asset restitution begins. The architecture forcibly terminates all active opposition, not weakens it, not reduces its influence, terminates it. Disbands lower matrix interference contracts. Removes from your environment every entity, every structure, every pattern that was authorized to test you during the trial phase but holds no standing now that the trial is complete. The permission those forces operated under is revoked, not by your effort, not by your warfare, by the ruling itself. The environment shifts at the structural level. The battlefield becomes a sanctuary. Not because you fought hard enough to win the ground, and you did fight, I'm not dismissing that, but you didn't produce this outcome with your warfare. The ground changed jurisdiction. The court reclassified the territory beneath your feet. What was contested is now a secured perimeter, and that security wasn't established by anything you did in the visible. It was established by decree. The kind of decree that doesn't require your agreement to be enforceable. So let me ask you something directly. What have you been carrying that belongs to a file that's already closed? Pause. And that pattern, a legal decree capping prolonged endurance with an authoritative command to cease and restore, didn't begin with the framework I've been describing. It predates every modern system you and I have ever moved through. It's older than the institution that trained me. Older than the language I spent 20 years learning to describe what cannot be said, older than the traditions that first named the mechanism. The structural pattern holds across every mystical tradition that ever recorded the experience of a human vessel being pushed past its natural limits and then released. What I'm about to walk you through is not theology. It's not doctrine. It's observational data collected across centuries by people who had no contact with one another, separated by geography, language, culture, and time, and yet every one of them described the same mechanism. Prolonged endurance under high pressure is always capped by an authoritative, unalterable divine intervention that commands the immediate cessation of suffering and the deployment of massive restoration. Always. The pattern doesn't vary. The details change, the language, the imagery, the cultural frame, but the structure underneath remains identical across the Hebrew prophetic tradition, the Christian esoteric tradition, and the Islamic mystical tradition. 3 traditions, 3 continents, 3 separate vocabularies, 1 identical architecture. The earliest recorded articulation I know of sits in the Hebrew prophetic canon, in the 40th chapter of Isaiah, and the way it opens matters. The voice doesn't make a suggestion. It doesn't offer comfort as a possibility. It doesn't mean the fighting stopped because the fighter got tired. It means the mandatory service period has reached its legal limit. The term tzvow refers to compulsory service, a term of conscription with a fixed duration written into the law. When that term expires, the soldier is released. Not because he performed perfectly, not because the war is over, because the law governing the length of his service has been satisfied. And that's the thing I missed for years. I read the passage as poetry. Comfort because God is merciful. Comfort because suffering has a purpose. Comfort because eventually things get better. I read it the way I was trained to read it, as theological encouragement dressed in prophetic language. But that's not what the text is doing. It's delivering a legal ruling. It's repurposed. The isolation becomes a roadway. The desolation becomes infrastructure for what is arriving. The exact terrain that held the testing becomes the terrain that carries the restoration. Same geography, different jurisdiction. 12 centuries later, a Spanish nun named Teresa of Avila sat in a cell writing down what she had experienced, and she described the identical mechanism using entirely different language. In the interior castle, El Castillo Interior, she mapped the spiritual journey as a progression through 7 dwelling places, each one a chamber in the soul's architecture, each one more interior than the last. The first 6 mansions are characterized by what she describes as fierce spiritual warfare. Demonic opposition, internal turmoil, aridity, doubt, the constant feeling of being tested and found wanting. The soul in the early mansions is still on the battlefield. It is fighting. The soul remains in this secret place with God in absolute calm and peace. The little butterfly dies with greatest joy because Christ is now its life. Here there are no wild beasts to disturb the soul. The devils are afraid of it and leave it alone. Read that last line again slowly. The devils are afraid of it. The battle ends not because the vessel won it, but because the vessel graduated out of the jurisdiction where the battle had authority. The little butterfly dies. That phrase stops me every time I read it. The version of you that had to fight, that had to prove, that had to scan for threats and brace for impact, that's what dies. Not because it was wrong. Because it was temporary. It served its function during the testing phase. And when the testing phase ends, the architecture that required defensive posture is no longer necessary. What replaces it isn't a stronger fighter. It's a vessel that no longer needs to fight. And then, roughly 400 years after Teresa, the Sufi master Ibn al-Arabi, al-Shaykh al-Akbar, the Grand Master of Islamic esoteric tradition, wrote in his vast work Al-Futuhat al-Mahiyya, the Meccan Revelations, about the journey through Fana into Baka. Fana is the complete dissolution of the ego. Not improvement, not refinement. Dissolution, the self that entered the trial gets systematically dismantled by the pressure of the trial itself. Every attachment, every identity, every protective structure the ego built to keep itself safe. The furnace doesn't care what it burns. It burns everything. He's still there. The environment hasn't changed. What changed is his standing inside it. The sword is sheathed. The jurisdiction has shifted. The world no longer has legal authority to touch him. 3 traditions. 3 vocabularies. A single structural law running beneath each of them. And here's what I've been moving toward, the thing I couldn't see when I was still standing in a lecture hall at the University of Edinburgh trying to make a legitimate institution believe that indigenous knowledge frameworks carried real, functional technology. The pattern isn't metaphorical, it's operational. Every tradition that documented this mechanism did so because they watched it happen in actual human lives, not as poetry, not as comfort, but as a predictable, repeatable sequence. Prolonged endurance. Legal limit reached. Authoritative decree issued. Testing ceases. Restoration begins. The question I've carried since the afternoon I first read Teresa alongside Ibn al-Arabi in a rented room in Leith, and it's a question I still don't have a clean answer for, is why the decree always arrives in the language of law, why every tradition frames the end of testing not as a parent finally relenting, but as a court ruling. Not the suffering ends because God felt sorry for you, but the suffering ends because the legal term has expired. Something about the architecture of reality makes this the consistent image across every culture that ever touched the experience. I don't think that's coincidence. And underneath that question is a second one, quieter and harder. If the decree is automatic once the legal limit is reached, what determines how long that limit lasts for any given person? Isaiah's conscripts served a fixed term. Teresa's soul moved through 6 mansions before the 7th opened. The test ends when the architecture can carry the weight it was built for. That's the measurement. That's always been the measurement, and that means there's something most people never consider about the moment the decree finally comes, something I didn't consider during my own 4 years in that rented room in Leith, watching 17 years of research gather dust inside a cardboard box. The hardest part of the whole sequence isn't the trial, it's what comes immediately after the ruling, because the ruling itself changes nothing about the nervous system. Pause. The ruling is a legal event. It closes the case. It terminates the jurisdiction under which the opposition operated. But the body that survived the testing phase has been soaking in its own stress chemistry for so long that defensiveness has stopped being a choice. It's become automatic, ingrained. You've spent months, for some of you, years, inside a state of continuous hypervigilance, auditing relationships, scanning conversations, bracing for the next financial blow, watching for the kind of spiritual opposition that always left evidence. That wasn't paranoia. That was accurate threat detection inside an actively hostile environment. And the body learned what it was taught. It learned that safety was temporary. That peace was just the moment before something broke. So the body stayed armed. The jaw stayed locked. The shoulders stayed raised. The eyes kept scanning even in rooms where nothing was moving. And then the decree comes. The body is still running the old program, still emitting a war signal. And here's the part no one explains when you're standing at the threshold of your restoration. Armor has weight. Defensiveness carries a frequency. Suspicion, grudge holding, that low constant readiness for conflict. These aren't just emotional states. They're postures. And they broadcast a signal that the architecture of reality reads as active combat. If you won't lower your guard after the final decree has been issued, your field keeps transmitting the frequency of a vessel still under fire. And you can't receive what belongs to a season of peace while you're still dressed for war. That's not a metaphor. That's closer to physics. Wealth can't settle into a clenched vessel. The kind of partnerships that belong to this next season can't anchor in a field still braced for betrayal. Deep healing, the cellular kind, the kind that reaches the marrow, can't begin in a body still running threat response as its default state. The very mechanism that kept you alive during the trial now keeps you sealed. The thing that protected you begins to isolate you. And the boundary that once held the darkness out now holds the restoration at arm's length too. So here is what has to happen. And I want to be clear, this isn't something you ease into, something you feel your way toward, something you grow into gradually over time. This is something you do, deliberately, consciously. Now, you have to put the armor down. You have to say it out loud. The vessel that survived this, the one that reflexively guarded every entrance, scanned every room, braced for every blow, that vessel now needs a different instruction. The battle is over. The court has ruled. My perimeter is held by something higher than anything that ever came against me. I release my defenses. I release my watch over the enemy. I release my expectation of the next hit. That's not a meditation. It's not an affirmation you repeat until it feels true. It's a command issued to a nervous system that has spent years ignoring commands. And the only way that nervous system finally accepts that the war is over, really accepts it, is when the body it's been protecting begins to feel something it hasn't felt in a very long time. Something so unfamiliar that most people, when it arrives, assume it means something has gone wrong. Pause, because here's what happens in a body that's been trained to read every shift as a threat. The absence of threat doesn't feel like safety. It doesn't feel like peace. It registers as alarm. Something is wrong. The nervous system doesn't have a category for genuine safety, not after years of this. It has danger, and it has the pause before danger returns. That's it. So when the pause stretches out longer than it ever has before, longer than the body has any memory of, the system doesn't relax. It escalates. It reads the quiet as a setup for something worse, and the body floods with the same chemistry it was producing in the middle of the fight, because the body cannot tell the difference between a war that's still active and one that's been legally terminated but hasn't yet reached the tissues. That is the victory crash. When the final decree clears the field, a physiological event begins, not gradually, not optionally. It arrives like a weight that's been suspended above you since the testing phase started, held up only by the adrenal momentum that carried you through years you probably shouldn't have survived. And the moment that suspension releases, everything your body has been deferring drops into the vessel at once. The symptoms are hard to miss. A fatigue so deep it feels like your bones are denser than they were yesterday. A heaviness in your limbs that makes ordinary movement something you have to consciously decide, step by step, like you're operating your own body from a distance. A fog across the mind that makes concentration feel like trying to read through clouded water. And underneath all of it, a pull towards sleep. Not ordinary sleep, not the kind where you wake up and check your phone. The kind where your body seems to be asking for days. Dark, still, uninterrupted, the kind that doesn't feel like rest so much as a command your biology is issuing that you don't have the authority to refuse. Pause. And almost everyone misreads this. How could you not? You've been told your whole life that fatigue means something is wrong. That pulling back means you're losing. That losing interest in the fight means the fight finally broke you. So when your body stops running the emergency program it's been running for months, years, and that sudden absence feels like collapse, you reach for the only categories you have: depression, defeat, something going wrong inside you. You tell yourself you're backsliding. You tell yourself the enemy finally got through. You take the heaviness in your limbs as evidence that you failed the very thing you just finished. None of that is true. What's actually happening is that your body is responding to a ceasefire. And it's not psychological. It's not something you can think your way out of or pray yourself past. It's autonomic. It begins at the level of the nervous system and cascades through every organ, every tissue, every cell that's been running in survival mode since the testing phase began. The victory crash is, at its most fundamental level, a rapid shift from chronic sympathetic nervous system activation into parasympathetic dominance. The sympathetic system, fight or flight, was designed for short bursts, seconds, minutes, an hour in an emergency. It was never built to run for years. But during the testing season, that's exactly what it did. The emergency became so constant that it stopped feeling like an emergency. You stopped noticing the elevated heart rate, the shallow breath, the jaw that never fully unclenched, the shoulders that crept toward your ears and stayed there. Those weren't symptoms anymore. That was just your normal. And now that normal is being taken apart. It starts in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. During the testing season, that system runs continuously hot. The hypothalamus secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone, which drives the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which pushes the adrenal cortex to flood the bloodstream with cortisol and catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, the exact biochemical cocktail that kept you moving through exhaustion that should have stopped you, thinking clearly through confusion that should have paralyzed you, functioning through an inflammatory load that, by any reasonable measure, should have put you in a hospital bed months ago. But the moment the brain registers that the threat environment has collapsed, the moment the decree clears and the perimeter locks and the architecture itself signals that the testing phase is over, the feedback loop reverses. The hypothalamus sharply reduces its ERH output. Cortisol levels plunge, and that drop removes the artificial biochemical fuel that's been keeping you upright through a level of burnout most people never come close to. The result is immediate, somatic, undeniable. Your body, stripped of that chemistry, doesn't power down gradually. It crashes. The limbs go heavy because the adrenaline that kept them light is gone. The mind goes foggy because the cortisol that sharpened every thought into something useful is no longer reaching the prefrontal cortex. The need for sleep becomes overwhelming because a system that's been deferring rest for years has just received the first real permission in its operational history to stop. And that is only the first cascade. According to the work of Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, a body coming out of long-term threat doesn't just relax. It moves through something more structured than that. A sequence. The first stage is sympathetic burnout. The mobilization system has used everything it had. Dopamine, serotonin, the fuel that kept you moving is simply gone, and then the body enters what the literature calls a dorsal vagal collapse, a temporary freeze state. Not dangerous. Restorative. Heart rate variability shifts, digestion slows, because the body is pulling its resources inward. Away from anything active, away from anything external, toward repair. And the brain induces sleep so heavy it overrides your intention entirely, because there are certain kinds of repair that can only happen there. Then, somewhere in that 48 to 72-hour window, the third stage begins. The ventral vagal complex takes over. This is the system that governs calm. Deep breathing, a resting heart rate that doesn't feel like it's bracing for something. And when this system integrates, it doesn't just return you to where you were before the testing started. It establishes a new baseline, one your body has never actually operated from, because by the time you were old enough to notice how your nervous system worked, it was already running the emergency program. Had been for years, and at the cellular level, something else is happening at the same time. During chronic stress, inflammation builds continuously. Pro-inflammatory proteins flood the body, the chemical signature of a system that believes it's under siege. Over months and years, that damage accumulates. In the organelles, in the proteins, in the cellular debris that piles up faster than a survival mode system can ever stop to clear it. But during the victory crash, the body turns on something called autophagy. A biological recycling process. It breaks down damaged components, clears misfolded proteins, removes what the emergency program never had time to clean. Autophagy can't run while the sympathetic system is active. It requires stillness. It requires the body to stop moving long enough for the maintenance to begin. And in the brain, the lymphatic system begins flushing metabolic waste that's been accumulating through months of high-stress survival. This is why the deep, heavy sleep of the victory crash isn't optional. It isn't laziness. It's the only state in which the brain can clear what the testing phase left behind. You're not sleeping too much. You're sleeping exactly as long as a body needs to decommission a war that lasted years. Pause. I want to stop here for a moment, not to make another point, just to say something directly to the person watching this right now who recognizes their own body in what I'm describing. I know what this feels like from the inside. I know the crash feels like failure, because failure is the only word your vocabulary has for a body that stops performing. I know the heaviness feels like depression, because depression is the only diagnosis the world offers for someone who can't get out of bed the way they used to. And I know there's a voice somewhere in the back of your mind saying that if you were really where you're supposed to be, if you were really walking in what was established over your life, you wouldn't be this tired. You'd be energized, ready. You wouldn't be lying in the dark at 2 in the afternoon with limbs that feel like they're filled with sand. That voice is wrong. The fatigue isn't evidence that something is broken. It's evidence that something just finished. The heaviness isn't depression. It's your body processing weight it's been carrying so long it forgot the weight was there. The collapse isn't a collapse. It's a landing. The first time your nervous system has touched solid ground since the testing phase began, and the unfamiliarity of it, the way safety feels like a threat, the way stillness feels like a warning, the way peace registers as the quiet before something breaks, that's not a sign you're doing it wrong. That's a sign your body has never, in its entire history, been given a genuine ceasefire to metabolize. So the only mandate now is to let it happen, not to push through it, not to analyze it or find a way to accelerate back to productivity. To unclamp the jaw, to lower the shoulders, to let the body rest. You're not on a battlefield anymore. You're sitting inside the newly secured perimeter of your own life, and the only order left is to stop guarding a gate that has already been sealed. Pause. Somewhere in the hours that follow, you're going to feel something you haven't felt in longer than you can accurately measure. It won't announce itself. It won't be dramatic. It'll simply happen quietly enough that you could miss it if you're not paying attention. You'll be lying still, not trying to achieve anything. And then your body will take a breath you didn't authorize. It'll come from somewhere below the diaphragm, below the conscious command structure, and it'll empty your lungs in a way that feels less like breathing and more like a valve opening that's been sealed since the testing began. The exhale will be long, involuntary, and it'll carry a sound you've never quite made before. Not a sigh of frustration, not exhaustion, not resignation. Something else. Something the old practitioners, the old lineages, the people who spent centuries carefully mapping the interior of the human body, they had a name for it. And the name they gave it translates roughly as the soul's release, the sigh a body produces when the perimeter is finally registered as secure. The sigh that means the watch is over, and right behind that exhale, without any effort, without any decision to relax or let go, you'll feel a warmth spreading down the back of your neck. It will move across the trapezius muscles, the ones that connect your neck to your shoulders, the ones that have been clenched so long you stopped noticing they were clenched at all. And as that warmth passes through them, the holding will simply dissolve, not gradually. Dissolve, the way ice crosses a threshold it can't survive. The jaw muscle will unclamp. Your teeth will part slightly. Your tongue will drop from the roof of your mouth, where it's been pressed in a posture of constant readiness. And for the first time since this began, your face will be at rest. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't poetry. This is something with a specific physical signature, the body's nervous system registering that the threat has passed, that the decree has been carried out, that the gate is sealed and the watch is over, and that it is no longer required to hold a defensive posture. The sigh is the body signing the receipt. It's the confirmation that the battle timeline has closed. And when it happens, not if, when, you will know. Because you will feel something you haven't felt in a very long time. You will feel safe. Pause. Not safe as an idea you hold in your mind. Not safe as something you tell yourself. Safe as a sensation in your body. Safe the way an animal feels when it finally lies down in tall grass after days of running. Safe the way a child feels when the door closes and the sound of the latch means the night is quiet now and no one else is coming through it. Safe in a way your body hasn't been able to register since the testing began, because the testing kept something in you permanently braced. And when something is permanently braced, safety can't land, even when it's already there. The exhale is the first token to unclamp the jaw, to lower the shoulders, to let the body rest. You're not on a battlefield anymore. You're sitting inside the newly secured perimeter of your own life, and the only order left is to stop guarding a gate that has already been sealed. Pause. Somewhere in the hours that follow, you're going to feel something you haven't felt in longer than you can accurately measure. It won't announce itself. It won't be dramatic. It'll simply happen quietly enough that you could miss it if you're not paying attention. You'll be lying still, not trying to achieve anything. And then your body will take a breath you didn't authorize. It'll come from somewhere below the diaphragm, below the conscious command structure. And it'll empty your lungs in a way that feels less like breathing and more like a valve opening that's been sealed since the testing began. The exhale will be long, involuntary, and it'll carry a sound you've never quite made before. Not a sigh of frustration, not exhaustion, not resignation. Something else. Something the old practitioners, the old lineages, the people who spent centuries carefully mapping the interior of the human body, they had a name for it. And the name they gave it translates roughly as the soul's release, the sigh a body produces when the perimeter is finally registered as secure. The sigh that means the watch is over, and right behind that exhale, without any effort, without any decision to relax or let go, you'll feel a warmth spreading down the back of your neck. It will move across the trapezius muscles, the ones that connect your neck to your shoulders, the ones that have been clenched so long you stopped noticing they were clenched at all. And as that warmth passes through them, the holding will simply dissolve, not gradually. Dissolve, the way ice crosses a threshold it can't survive. The jaw muscle will unclamp, your teeth will part slightly. Your tongue will drop from the roof of your mouth, where it's been pressed in a posture of constant readiness, and for the first time since this began, your face will be at rest. This isn't a metaphor, this isn't poetry, this is something with a specific physical signature, the body's nervous system registering that the threat has passed, that the decree has been carried out, that the gate is sealed and the watch is over, and that it is no longer required to hold a defensive posture. The sigh is the body signing the receipt. It's the confirmation that the battle timeline has closed. And when it happens, not if, when, you will know. Because you will feel something you haven't felt in a very long time. You will feel safe. Pause. Not safe as an idea you hold in your mind, not safe as something you tell yourself. Safe as a sensation in your body. Safe the way an animal feels when it finally lies down in tall grass after days of running. Safe the way a child feels when the door closes and the sound of the latch means the night is quiet now and no one else is coming through it. Safe in a way your body hasn't been able to register since the testing began, because the testing kept something in you permanently braced, and when something is permanently braced, safety can't land, even when it's already there. The exhale is the first token.